pleasure to be here today in this event organized by the London Business School students, an education institution with whom we have a lot of strong linkages, and we really appreciate. And if we start back, if we go back to the 19th century, the 19th century was the Industrial Revolution. The 20th century was the technological revolution. And the 21st century is going to be the century of the energy and natural resources revolution. So the key thing in the future is going to be energy and natural resources. And I think that right now is an exciting time to be a professional in the energy war. But it's also a very challenging time. And when I say it's a very challenging time, it's for different reasons. First, because the energy sector is full of trade-offs that need to be made. We want energy to be sustainable. Sustainable from different points of view, from an economic cost point of view, from an independency or security of supply point of view, and from an environmental point of view. And reaching the three at the same time, having low-cost energy, being independent, and at the same time being environmentally friendly is not easy. Another trade-off that we need to manage is the three different time scenarios that we are facing. If we are talking about environmental issues, we are measuring time in centuries. The implications of environmental problems are measured in centuries. If we are talking about the investments we need to do, we are talking about decades. And being this a very regulated industry, we need to deal with politicians, and politicians normally have a time frame who is 4 years. In some cases, not even 4 years, 2 years, because after 2 years, they start to think in the next election. And in some cases, it's not even 2 years. It's the next Monday or the next day press front page. So managing also these centuries, decades, and days is also something that creates a lot of challenges. So the energy sector is an important sector and is full of challenges. And today I'm going to cover 4 issues. I'm going to cover in the first section, which are those challenges in terms of demand, supply, environmental challenges. I'm going to talk about how innovation and technology can extend the frontiers of supply. I will address then how improvements in efficiency can have a major impact in the demand, and we will see several examples. And finally, I will cover lightly how effective public and private partnerships can ensure the progress of the energy sector. So starting with the challenges, let's have a look at the growth of the global demand. And according to the International Energy Agency, global energy demand is going to increase by 47% between now and 2035. This is more or less, or this represents more or less 5.8 billion of tons of oil equivalent. For the people that are not very used to talk about energy, that may mean a lot less, but let me translate that. That increase in energy demand is equivalent to 27 times the UK demand in 2010. That's how the world energy demand is going to grow in the next 25 years. And 91% of that growth is going to come from non-OECD countries. 34% is going to come from China, 17% is going to come from India, and 14% is going to come from Middle East and Africa. So that means that in 2035, 2/3 of the global energy demand is going to come from countries that are not in the OECD. And which are the two drivers of that growth? The two drivers of that growth are, first, the increase in population. The more population we have in the world, the more energy demand. And in the next year, we are going to add 2.5 billion people in the world. But not only we are going to add people, we are also going to increase the way people live and the quality of life of people. And that also requires a lot of energy. And just to put an example, if we are talking about cars, because that has a direct impact in oil consumption. In the US, we have 600 cars per 1,000 inhabitants. In Europe, we have 400. In China, we have 18. I'm not assuming that China is going to move from 18 to 600, not even to 400, but just doubling or tripling the number of cars in China is going to increase a lot the demand of oil. So this is really a huge challenge. And we need to see whether we can meet that demand challenge. And if we look at the supply, and I put as an example oil, oil represents 33% of the energy mix, the global energy mix. It's going down. I mean, in 1980, it represented 43%. So we are becoming a less dependent oil economy. But in any case, it still represents 33%. And only 50% of the production needed in 2013 has already been discovered. So we need to discover 50% of the production we will need to meet demand in 2030. 19 million barrels will need to come from yet-to-find sources. And just to give an idea, I mean, those 19 million barrels a day is equivalent to 1.7 times Saudi output in 2010. 8.5 billion barrels need to come from unconventional oil. And again, to put at that in an equivalent, this is the production this year of Iran and China together. And the rest will need to come from other sources like NGL. So we have a big challenge in front of us. And moreover, the volumes that are being discovered are declining. And they are declining for four reasons. First, the level of discoveries is decreasing. In the 60s, in the decades of the 60s, 394 billion barrels were discovered. If we take the decade of the 2000, from 2000 to 2010, only 150 billion barrels. So we have discovered 30% less than we used to discover in the 60s. At the same time, the current fields are declining, and they are declining according to the International Energy Agency at a 6.7% rate every year. So every year, those fields are producing between 5, 6, 7% less than previous year. At the same time, all the discoveries that we are making are smaller also in the sense that since 1990, there has not been any supergiant field discovery. I mean, the last one, and when I mean supergiant field, is above 10 billion barrels. The last one was discovered in 1990. And finally, there are certain places where production has limits because of political issues. And a good example is Iran production, that in October this year is half of what it used to be in 1970. So all that is putting a lot of pressure in the energy sector. But there is another challenge, which is the environmental challenge, starting with the climate change. And if we talk a little bit about climate change, the global CO2 emissions, and you all are familiar with the issues related with CO2 emissions and the climate change and everything, they rose by 38% between 1990 and 2009. And according to the experts, if we don't do anything, if we remain business as usual, they are going to grow by 50% more until 2035. If we want to achieve a sustainable level, and sustainable level according to different sources is, okay, let's try to maintain the world temperature less than 2 more degrees Celsius. So let's try to limit the growth of the temperature in the Earth up to 2 degrees. That is the 450 part per million scenario. We need to reduce CO2 emissions by 50%. Is that possible? I'm going to tell you the size of the challenge. I mean, first, we will need to start working with the traditional, conventional energy sources. This is the column I have there, which says new policies. To reduce this 1/3 of the gap, we will need to, as an example, reduce coal generation by 50% by 2035. Is it going to be possible to reduce coal generation by 50% by 2035 when China is already building 47 plants this year? So there will be 47, nearly one every week in China, or when Southeast Asia countries, Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, they are going to duplicate the coal generation in their energy mix. Are we going to be able to reduce by 50% coal generation? We will need to reduce oil-fired generation by 67%. And we will need to increase gas generation by 22%. And if we do all that, we will be able to reduce 7 gigatons of CO2 emissions, only 1/3 of the gap. So it's not enough, we need to do more things. So we could adopt innovative supply technologies, renewables. In order to reduce another 7 gigatons, we will need to increase solar by 5 times the current solar capacity we have right now in the world. We will need to increase wind by 12 times. We will need to increase hydro by 2 times, knowing that, I mean, building new hydro is extremely complicated because of environmental issues. And we will need to convert 1/3 of the coal generation plants to clean coal power generation plants with CCS, carbon capture and sequestration technologies that, as you know, currently are still in the pilot phase and they are still very expensive. And with that, we will only reduce 7 gigatons. So we need another 7, and this another 7 will come from energy efficiency. So it's a huge challenge we have in front of us. So let me start with the first part, with how we can do on the supply side. And on the supply side, as I mentioned at the beginning, we are confronting these trade-offs between we want cheap energy, we want available and secure energy, and we want environmentally friendly energy. And combining the three, as I said, is very complicated. Europe has put in the last years a lot of emphasis on the environment at the detriment of the cost. And now we have all the issues about what is the cost of energy and whether we are able to afford the increasing cost due to the strong investment that certain countries are doing in renewables. And a very good example is Spain, where we have a huge tariff deficit because of the implementation and the push, a strong push towards renewables that the Spanish government adopted. Asia, on the contrary, has put more emphasis on security of supply, reducing their dependency from foreign sources, and on growth, and much less on the environment. They are going to continue to build coal plants, not because they don't want to be environmentally friendly, but they need to grow, and they need the energy, and therefore they need to continue to invest. And obviously China is, investments in renewable energy are growing at 17% every year, but even growing at 17%, they need also to build nuclear, and they need also to build coal-fired plants, and also to need gas-fired plants. So because they are really in need of energy. And then there is the US. And the US was interesting because they have been struggling within the US. I mean, in the US, there is not a common policy. Every state has its own objectives. So if you go to California, they are very pushy on green energy, and they have been pushing a lot and subsidizing and helping the development of a renewable energy sector. But if you go to other places in the US where they have coal mining or where they have oil and gas, they have very different perspectives on what should be the future. But currently, the situation in the US has changed drastically. And we're in a situation where probably the US has been able to solve these trade-offs, the trade-offs between cost, security of supply, and environmentally friendly. And that has happened through two things: technology and innovation. And let me put you an example of the shale gas. And as the dean of the London Business School was saying, I mean, shale gas has changed the paradigm of the energy sector in the US. Just as a background, I mean, natural gas represents 23% of the energy mix in the world and is increasingly important. I mean, in the 80s, it used to represent 17, and now is at 23% of the mix. In generation, I mean, in the 90s, 18% of the power generation in the US was gas-fired. Now it's 40%. And in Europe, it used to be 15%, and now it's 60%. So gas is playing more and more a role in power generation in the world. And gas supplies comes from very few countries. We have Russia, that has 49 TCMs, Iran 30, Qatar 25, Arabia 8, and Turkmenistan 8. So 5 countries represent more or less 65% of the gas supplies in the world. So let's think also about the geopolitical impact of that. But the gas revolution in the US, the shale gas revolution, has been a game-change event. And a game-change event in the 3 dimensions. First, in availability. We have moved from 1.4 billion cubic feet per day in 2005, as you can see in the graphic, towards 24.4 billion cubic feet per day in 2012. And now, natural gas represents, or shale gas or non-conventional gas represents 35% of the US domestic gas production. And it will represent 57% by 2030. The United States has moved from being an importer of gas to be a potential exporter of gas. Right now, they are not exporting because they are using internally, and also because they need to reconvert the regasification plants into a liquefaction plant. But that's a $5 billion investment for a 10 BCM plant, so it's something that can be done and will be done in the future. And all the utilities in Europe that used to ship gas to the US in the peak of the summer with the hot weather, or in the peak in the winter with a very cold winter, I mean, now they are not going to export anymore. They are probably going to receive gas from the US. So availability has been solved. Cost, the US gas price, as you can see in the chart, has gone from $8.7 per million BTU in 2005 to a situation right now where it is 2.5. And we also remember that there has been peaks in 2008 where the gas price was even at $12.7. So very, very cheap source of energy. And that has reduced, obviously, the cost of power generation because the increase in the power generation generated by gas. And finally, it has also increased sustainability. Why? Because more and more coal plants are being switched, or we are stopping coal plants and having more and more gas plants. And gas-fired plants have 1/3 less emission than 1/3 of the emissions of the coal-fired plant. So we are becoming even more friendly from the environment. There are certain concerns about the environmental issues of fracking, and we'll talk more in detail. And for example, one of them is the water consumption. I mean, right now, the 35,000 wells that we have in the US are consuming the equivalent of the water consumption of a city like Chicago or of a city like Houston. But in general, we have been able, through the shale gas revolution, which is driven by the technology, to have more availability of gas, cheaper prices, and a more environmentally friendly mix of generation. So the trade-offs can be solved. And the key, as I was saying, has been technology. And the technology, I mean, the reason of the shale gas boom has been the combination of 2 technologies. One, the horizontal drilling that was developed in the last decade, and then hydraulic fracturing. And the combination of these 2 had made accessible the exploration of this shale gas that has been always there, but that in the past we were not able to drill and extract. And reality, as you can see in the graph, is that the horizontal drilling, who used to represent in year 2000 only 5% of the drilling, now it represents 70% of the well footage drilled today in the US. The second area of innovation, the first one was all these around the shale gas, the fracking and the horizontal drilling. The second area of innovation is an area where we need to grow a lot, which is renewables. And historically, renewables have been considered the key solution to sustainability and independence. However, they have two problems. One is that they are intermittent availability. So we have electricity only when there is a sun. And we have electricity only when there is wind. And if there is no wind, there is no energy generation. So it's not something that is base load energy. And it requires to have a base load generation mix to support the lack of production. And it also has a very high cost. And cost is important. The energy cost is very important because more and more we are talking about fuel poverty. And fuel poverty is when more than 10% of the income of the people goes into fuel cost. And in the UK, there's a major issue. There are right now nearly 4 million households in the UK, in England, that are expected to fall in fuel poverty. And that's even higher in Wales, 26%, or in Scotland, 28%. So having lower prices of energy is very important for the governments, it's very important for the society. And right now, I mean, renewables have the problem that they are not still there. They will. And they will because technology and because of the experience curves. And here I put two examples. One is the wind turbines. And the wind turbines, as you can see in the left-hand side chart, have gone or are 48% cheaper now than they used to be in 84. The experience curve shows that every time we double the production of wind turbines, the cost falls by 5%. Same thing with solar PV. Solar PV is even steeper. I mean, a solar module in 2011 is only 7% of that of 84. And the unit cost reduced by 21% every time the production doubles. And as many countries are going to increase their production of renewable energy, that means that it will continue to fall down. And that will be a good way to show how the renewable energy can become totally competitive with the conventional energy in the future. Just to give you some data about the situation in the UK, in 2011, UK wind generation has total 15.5 terawatt hours of energy, which is equivalent of the power that the London Tube is going to consume in the next 13 years. So now it's starting to become sizable, or in a more anecdotic way, but being in England, you need to make that, equivalent. I mean, UK solar generation has total 220 gigawatt hours, which is equivalent to the energy needed to serve tea for 25% of the UK households. So it's not going to be anecdotic in the future. It's going to represent an important part of the energy mix in the future, providing we continue to get experience and we continue to reduce the cost. A third area of innovation is in the conventional generation. I mean, we shouldn't think that all the innovation is going to be in renewables, in the new frontiers, or it's going to be in shale gas. It's also possible to increase the efficiency in conventional generation. And a good example is fossil fuel power generation, who represents fossil fuels represent 81% of the world energy needs. We are still a very hydrocarbon-based society. And UK and Ireland, this is our good news, have led the fossil fuel power generation efficiency. UK and Ireland are at 45% efficiency compared to the 34% efficiency in China. That means that in UK and Ireland, you can produce 32% more electricity for the same amount of input that you put. So for the same amount of coal or for the same amount of gas, you produce 32 more electricity in the UK and Ireland than you produce in China. And this is something we need to continue to invest. We need to continue to invest in this kind of technologies that allow us to improve the efficiency of the conventional generation. Another area of innovation is nuclear. And as the Dean of London Business School say, I mean, nuclear has gone from being the god to being the evil. And nuclear represents right now 14% of the power generation in megawatts, and in the worldwide, and 28% in Europe. So still, it represents a lot. There are nearly 445 plants, and that has gone through a different series of, I mean, before Chernobyl, every year there were 25 new plants in the world. After Chernobyl, there was a slowdown in the energy generation, nuclear generation, and there were only 5 new plants every year. Back in 2010, everybody was talking in the press about the nuclear renaissance, and everybody was thinking that the nuclear was going to come back. Reality is that Fukushima happened, and then many governments have put on hold their plans. Some countries have decided to stop nuclear, as Germany, Switzerland. Even Italy conducted a referendum a month after Fukushima, and you guess what was the answer? No. Nuclear has been efficient, I mean 5.5 cents. There has been a lot of new technology development in terms of improving the security, but after Fukushima, after all the new security requirements, after all the new investment need to do to next generation, the cost that we forecast going forward is going to be higher. The new build of a nuclear is going to be much more than around the 5.5 that we used to have in. So a lot of technological improvement, but also some issues with security and some issues with cost. And finally, there are certain emerging technologies where we are progressing, where there is a lot of new technological advances, but they are progressing very slowly. I mean, there is tidal wave energy generation that has a huge potential, but so far very limited application. The UK government estimates that we could install by 2020 2 gigawatts of that, and up to 30 gigawatts by 2050. So it's still a long way to go. Another technology who is very much needed and where people were talking a lot in the past was CCS, carbon capture and sequestration. But still CCS is very expensive, and there are very few industrial scale projects. I mean, the first one was built in Norway back in 1996, Sleipner, and it stores 1 million tons a year of CO2, sorry. The second one is Snow White in Norway, it stores 0.7 million tons. But if we compare that with the gap I mentioned before, who is 29 billion tons, I mean, you could imagine how many CCS, carbon capture and sequestration plants, and how many new clean coal plants we need to build in order to confront that major challenge that we have in front of us. And also, it's very expensive. I mean, just the injection cost is $17 per ton of CO2. So it's very expensive yet. So we need to continue to invest. The UK government has set up recently a task force to reduce the CCS cost, but still long way to go. So that was on the supply side. If we go on the demand side, we need to consume less. This is clear. But it's not about consuming less. It's more about being more efficient, being more frugal in the way we use energy in the world. And if we see the demand, I mean, 32% of the demand is represented by the transportation demand, 29% by industry, domestic represents 26%, and services represents 13%. And according to the recent study from the German government, a 42% reduction in energy demand is feasible only by applying energy efficiency measures. And a good example is Japan. And let's go to Japan at Fukushima. I mean, in 2011, the supply in Japan was 195 gigawatts. That was the supply that we had in Japan. Fukushima happened, then they stopped all the nuclear production in Japan, and we lost 23 gigawatts of energy. So that means that the supply in 2012 was 171 gigawatts. That's the maximum output that Japanese economy could generate of electricity. The peak demand in 2011 was 180. So that means that we didn't have enough energy to supply all the demand that was needed in Japan. What has happened in reality? In reality is that first, we have been very happy because the climate was good this year. So 11 gigawatts have been less demand because of climate issues. But 13 gigawatts, so half of the gap that we had, has been solved by power saving and energy efficiency. So Japan has been able to catch up or to solve the lack of energy because of the Fukushima just by applying energy efficiency measures, which is very good news. And that shows us that if a country works together, we can reduce energy efficiency in a very good way. And the savings can come mainly in two areas. One is transportation, and one is domestic. I mean, domestic can represent 37% of the total reduction in consumption, and transport can represent 31%. So let's look at them in a little bit more detail. If I start with domestic sector, the domestic sector is the biggest source of efficiency improvement. And 90% of that is the efficiency potential that we have related with the buildings, with the homes where we live, with the offices where we work. And 60% or more than 60% of that, if you can see in the chart, is the refurbishing of existing buildings that we are already. Putting more insulation, changing the glasses. I mean, refurbishing the building can give us a lot of the, more than 60% of that saving potential that we have in front of us. Transportation is also very important. And transportation is important, and especially road transportation, because 73% of the transport emissions are coming from road transportation. And this is important because road transportation is not going down, it's going up. And then if you remember the figures that I mentioned at the beginning when I say China is 18 vehicles per inhabitant compared to the 400 and 600, gasoline demand in China is going to multiply by 4 between now and 2030. Can we improve that? Can we afford that? Obviously, we need to increase the fuel efficiency. And all the governments are totally committed to increase fuel efficiency in their cars. In Europe, I mean, if I take the figures, in 95, we had 154 grams of CO2 per kilometer. The objective is that in 2020, we would like to have only 95 grams of CO2 per kilometer, which represents a 38% reduction. In the US, the situation is even worse. I mean, as I say, Europe was 154. US, they have 240 grams of CO2 per kilometer. That means that the US is emitting 56% more per car than the Europeans. But the US is also committing to a big improvement in efficiency. They are reducing by 36% emissions, and they have put a target of 152 grams of CO2 for 2020, which is more or less what Europe is emitting right now. And technology here also plays a role. I mean, and I put here a good example, who is the BMW car. Same car, from two periods, I mean in 2072 and the 2012 model. The 2012 BMW 520i achieves right now 45% better efficiency than the 1972 model, even though it has much more power and is much more heavier. So even with 31% powerful engine and 31% heavier car, they are able, or they have been able through technology, to reduce the emissions by 45%. So great news. And that has been done through improved aerodynamics, more efficient engines, everything. The next generation will be to continue to innovate in the engine, to reduce the emissions of the traditional engines, to have lighter engines, and hybrids. Hybrids are going to become the next movement. Right now, there are nearly 6 million hybrid cars in the world sold by October 2012. So that's the future. The hybrid, then it will be the plug-in hybrid, and then it will be the electrical vehicle. The electrical vehicle is a good solution, but currently is still very, very marginal. I mean, first, it's expensive. It's $10,000 more expensive than the normal car. And a lot of that is because of the battery cost. The battery cost should go 60% lower if we want to have, I would say, a car that can be sold at a reasonable price. And that requires experience curves again. So the more electrical vehicles that will be produced, the more likelihood that the battery cost will go down, and we will reach the $360 per kilowatt hour that we plan for 2020, that will make the batteries cost competitive. So, but the reality is that I was saying that electrical vehicles right now only represent 0.1% of the total demand. I mean, in the UK, there are right now only 3,300 cars that have been registered in the UK. And in Spain, a country that has been pushing a lot the electrical vehicle, we only have 450 cars. So still a long way to go, but something that will probably be more important in the future, especially considering the fact that China, for example, has a plan or an objective of having 5 million electric cars by 2020. So again, if China goes in that direction, and they will need to go because of the car evolution that they will have in the country, that will mean that we will reach the experience curve and the cost reduction. And this is an area where public policy and subsidies and incentives coming from the government, but also incentives coming from the market. And oil price is a very good incentive to increase the efficiency of the cars. And this is a very good example of the light vehicle production in the US. And you can see two periods, the ones in green in the chart. The first one was between 75 and 82, where fuel efficiency improved by 61%. And why it improved by 61%? Because the oil price went up. And people, when oil price goes up, they try to be more efficient, and they buy much more efficient cars. Same thing in the period between 2004 and 2011. Price was going up, fuel efficiency has improved by 20%. In the period, the brown period that you saw in the middle, you see in the middle, with oil prices being not so in a high period, reality was that there was no incentives to be more efficient, and the efficiency decreased. And all that brings us to the last point I wanted to mention, who is the public policy, and how we can address that. We have seen the innovation part, the technology part, from the supply and from the demand side. Now, what can we do? What is the challenge we have? And we should not expect that this is something that is going to be solved just by the politicians. And a good example is the Kyoto Protocol. I mean, the Kyoto Protocol was introduced in '97. It was the United Nations Climate Summit. 37 industrialized countries agreed and committed to reduce emissions. They wanted to they put the objective of being 5% less emissions than the 2009 level. But what happened? First, many countries did not sign the agreement, the Kyoto Protocol. China did not sign, Morocco did not sign, many others. US signed, but then has not ratified it. And there are certain countries that sign and then have pulled out, like Canada. Copenhagen conference was a failure. Cancun, some improvements. Doha right now, last week, again, no major changes. The solution is not going to come from the politicians. The solution is not going to come from the countries because there are very divergent things. I mean, it's very good to be clean. It's very good to be environmentally friendly, but it has a huge cost. And the emerging countries are saying, we want to grow. We want to grow as you grow, the developed countries, and we need energy, and we don't have the funds to invest heavily in being clean. So either you help us, or we will continue to build coal generation plants, gas generation plants, rather than renewables. And even if your country, as I was saying, China, with 17% annual growth rate in renewables, is trying to, the change is going to be very slow. So it's going to be very difficult to get from governmental agreements to get the solution for the energy challenge we have in front of us. Also, it requires a lot of investments. And it requires a lot of investments to fill the growth in renewables. Renewables investments have grown by 31% annually between 2004 and 2011. In 2011, it added up to $260 billion invested in green energy. Just to compare, that is 18 times the investment needed by the Olympic Games in London. And everybody's investing. US is investing $100 billion, China 52. And the investments are made mainly in solar, with $147 billion in solar and $84 billion in wind. The problem is how to finance that. And whether, I mean, traditionally 61% has been funded by asset finance, by project finance, and less than 2% has been funded by government R&D funds. So there is a lot of need for private initiative. And the question, and I will close with that, the question is whether is there going to be enough funding in a crisis situation like right now for that. And I will put example, who is example of the offshore wind in Europe. And if we take the offshore wind in Europe, the target that we have in Europe is 40 gigawatts. Out of these 40 gigawatts, there are 6 that have already been financed or funded, and 17 that need to be funded through traditional sources, but there are 17 that we need still to find how to finance them. So are we going to reach the 40 gigawatts targets in wind offshore in Europe? I hope so, but financing is going to become an issue. And I think that's something that you will be debating in one of the panel sessions afterwards. So in summary, just to finish, my conclusion is that first, the global energy systems is facing major challenges. Demand is going to rise. I mentioned 47% in the next years. There is going to be a more constrained and more expensive energy supplies. And we are going to face very important environmental challenges. In order to do that, the answer should come from innovation and technology, because they are key to extend the supply. And we have seen several examples, shale gas being one of them, but also in renewables. Energy demand needs to be managed, and we need to be much more efficient. Unless we as citizens, we become more efficient, we are not going to be able to address the big gap we have in front of us. And then, final measures, global level policy is not enough. There is a need for a lot of private investments, and we need to fund and find ways to finance all those private investments. Thank you very much.
Richard Hooks, no direct affiliation, I'm afraid I'm not an alumnus. I just had a question regarding offshore wind and the levels of public funding that seem to be required. Mm-hmm. Do you see the high level of subsidy required as being a break from stopping any major investment on the grounds that the margins are too thin?
I think that financing of offshore wind is going to be complicated, no? And one good example is Germany, where, if I remember the latest figures, they have only achieved 1% of the objective they had for wind offshore, no? And as I say, it's complicated to find those. Traditional finance and project finance accounts for half of the funding needed. But the rest, we will need to find very innovative things, no? On top of that, we need also to make sure that technology works. And one of the major questions right now is the maintenance of these wind offshore parks, no? Because, we know how to maintain and we know how to do it with onshore wind. That's a proven technology. It's easy to do it, but we don't know very well about corrosion in the sea, about how to maintain in bad weather conditions. So it's still, I would say, something that technology needs to evolve, and we need to see the reality, no? So that may put also some pressure in terms of project risks, no? People saying, well, should I invest here when there are many additional risks apart from the financing risk, no?
Jamal Gore, Carbon Clear. I was just wondering if you could speak briefly about the impact that the shale gas revolution is likely to have on further progress towards energy efficiency or renewables, especially in the States, but perhaps here as well.
Yeah. The shale gas revolution, who has been able to break the dilemma between cost, environment, and is putting pressure on the renewable energy. Why? Because in some cases you say, okay, I can achieve similar targets in terms of environmentally friendly energy by using gas. Gas is cheap, is available, and it requires less investment than renewable energy. So I think in the short term, it's going to put some pressure. The aggressive plans of growth of renewable energy are going to be probably a little bit slowed down. In the future, I think it will be different, because I have the conviction that the renewable energy prices are going to go down, through all the experience curves, and I have shown several examples, and that means that in the future we will be able to have renewable energy who is going to be much more competitive. But in the short term in the US, clearly, now everything is around gas, and gas not only for power generation, but also gas as for vehicles. And in fact, there are several initiatives in the US and also in Europe to have vehicles powered by gas, and creating certain corridors across Europe, or creating changing the fleets in the US to have the cars powered by gas. No?
Hi, my name's Lewis from Imperial College. You didn't mention anything in your presentation about carbon taxes or trading schemes for carbon allowances. Do you think they still have a role to play, or do you think they've become somewhat redundant in the face of the energy efficiency, the innovation and technology that you mentioned?
Yeah. That's a hot debate, no? Whether you should have carbon taxes or you should buy credits. And different countries are having different approaches, no? The good thing about carbon taxes is at least it gives a certain certainty on the cost. What is more complicated for the industrial companies that need to invest in new plants, cement plants or steel plants, is the uncertainty, not knowing how much is going to be the price of the CO2 emission right that they need to buy. No? So whereas the taxation at least allows you to know, okay, this is going to be the tax, I know that, and then I do my investment based on that kind of additional cost that I need to bear. No? So I think that I will go in favor of certainty things rather than situations where you have more uncertainty and where you could have this kind of what is called carbon leakage, who is the transfer of the industrial plants from Europe to places where you don't need to pay those taxes or you don't need to buy those emission rights.
Ignacio Alet, MBA 2014 from LBS. Thank you very much for your presentation. It's been very insightful. Regarding shale gas, you mentioned that US is going to become an exporter in the future. But for doing so, you mentioned also that they need liquefaction factories or plants, sorry. But even if the investment makes sense, they need political support for that. Do you think that it's likely with all these movements and all these political changes that they will give so in the future? Thank you very much.
I don't think there will be a big boom in exports from the US, but US is going to have the opportunity of exporting gas because, I mean, they will have and they will do what the Europeans were doing before. I mean, the Europeans were, every time there was a peak in demand in the US, they were diverting ships, and ships that were going to the European markets, they were sent to the US because of the high price differentials between Europe and the US. What the US is going to do in the future is, because of the change of the regasification plants into liquefaction plants, and the investment is not very high, and there are certain projects already starting to happen in the US, they are going to have the opportunity to export gas when there are high prices in Europe or in other places, or in Asia. So I think it's much more the option rather than a reality. But the reality is that from being an importer, US is going to be in a position to be exporter.
Hi, I'm Diane Vickery. I'm a master's in management student at LBS. I was wondering what you think about the technology surrounding energy storage and how that will change the game.
Sorry?
So storing...
No, yeah. That's a very good question. It's a very good question because the future of renewables is, as I was saying, is based on the cost they can achieve, but also it has a lot to do with the capacity of a storage in energy. And storage is an area where more and more companies are investing, either in very, simple things like batteries storage, where you accumulate the energy, but also in more sophisticated technologies. And I think that's the key. I mean, if we are able to storage renewable energy, that will be a basis for the future. And there are certain technologies that are already being able to do that. I mean, CSP, thermosolar, has the possibility of storing because they have some salts that can keep the heat for certain hours. So even if there is no sun, you can still produce energy. Wind generation is now also being, then you also have the possibility of linkaging renewable generation plants with hydropower where you put the water up during the night and then you throw the water during the day. So there are certain ways, but storage I think is an area where there is going to be a lot of investments in the future because that's key. The same way that another area where more and more we are going to see a revolution is in the distributed energy. I think because of all the grid-related issues, the losses with the grids, the need for making big investments in grids, distributed generation is going to become more popular in Europe in the coming years.
Bruno Herdeiro, BCG LBS alum, currently with BCG. Historically, governments have incentivized renewable energies through feed-in tariffs and other mechanisms. Right now, we have very high deficits, government deficits. Could we use, instead of the carrot, a stick and reduce government deficits by taxing, I don't know, petrol prices, electricity costs that come from conventional energy? Is that a way that you can balance your government? Could that help?
Yeah. Well, that's a reality already. I mean, if you take Spain, where we have the big tariff deficit, who is right now larger than $24 billion, or billion euros, sorry, and is increasing every year. You need to do that. And that's what recently has been made by the Spanish government, where they have put some taxation to conventional generation, but also to renewable generation, in order to. The problem is that you only can do that going forward, because I mean, if you change the conditions of the past, then you start to introduce lack of security, of legal security, and then who is going to invest in a country where the legal agreements are not respected, no? And a good example recently is Argentina, no? With the expropriation of the oil sector, no? So they need to do things, but it's very difficult to do that. And obviously taxation is going to be one of them, but it's going to be taxation going forward, no? But again, taxation, what will be the implication? The implication is that because of the taxation, the pool price is going to go up. And at the end of the day, the cost of the electricity is going to increase. And as I say, it's very, I mean, fuel poverty is starting to be an issue. Because in a crisis situation, you cannot raise prices higher. I mean, in Spain we are paying much lower prices than we should pay. But who is the one who is going to say, let's increase the prices, no? And in many countries, energy is being subsidized. I mean, in many countries in Asia, in many countries in Latin America, energy is fully subsidized by the government. And it's very tough in a crisis situation to raise prices.
My name is Grima Björnsson, geothermal reservoir engineer. I'm just curious, because I come from an industry who is doing now about 10 gigawatt of power. Why geothermal was missing in your presentation?
That's a good point. It was not missed by design, missed because I mean I couldn't talk about anything. But geothermal is a very interesting source of geothermal has, as you know, is not something that you can do in every country. There are certain regions around the world where you can have a strong geothermal. One of them being Indonesia, and there is a corridor around the world where you can have that. So, it's a very good, and I have clients also that are investing heavily there. So you're right in mentioning that, and I'm sorry not have mentioning more explicitly all the advances. But again, there is something I also would like to talk, and your question is the environmental issues related with that, no? And probably you know the situation in Switzerland, where they built a geothermal plant. And the day they were inaugurating the geothermal plant, for whatever reason that has nothing to do with that, there was a small earthquake, and then everybody associated earthquake with geothermal, and they say, ban it. So, and that's the problem. The problem is with energy, we are dealing with environmental issues, and they may be right or wrong. In this case, the Switzerland case, it was wrong. But people associated that with geothermal, but in general, geothermal is very safe, it's environmentally friendly, it has nothing to do with any problems, and is a very good source of energy going forward. But same thing with fracking. I mean, fracking in the US is very controversial, and no one asked that, but I mean, we have been talking about the shale gas boom in the US, and normally the question is there going to be a shale gas boom in Europe or in China? And the answer is, we don't know. And we don't know why, because fracking technology is not being very controverted in Europe. And in Europe, environmental positions are very strong, and there are certain countries like France that have said, no, we don't want horizontal drilling. There are certain regions in Spain that have said no. There is a place like Bulgaria where they have reached an agreement with Chevron to do that, and they have stopped the agreement with Chevron. There are places like in Poland where there is a huge potential of shale gas that is not getting traction because the technology is not there yet, is much more deeper, and there are also strong environmental concerns. So environmental issues are extremely important in the planning ahead of the energy sector. No? And the other factor that we didn't touch in this presentation is all the geopolitical implications of all of that. I mean, what's going to be the relationship between US and Saudi Arabia when US is much less dependent on the oil coming from Saudi? Iran, we mentioned this morning, the Arab Spring. So there are many issues that are also geopolitically affected.
Please join me in thanking Dr. Marten for a fantastic presentation.